everyone. I'm Josh Humphreys. It's nice to meet all of you or see a few of you again. Thanks for coming out tonight to our Atlanta City Design Housing conversation. Looking forward to the next hour and a half or so, talking about housing policy, and the way that the design of our city is shaping our conversation around housing affordability and what we can do to make Atlanta work better for everyone and to make it a more affordable and inclusive place to live. And so tonight, excited to have Stephanie Stokes, Joel Dixon, and Tim Keene here with us to talk about the questions facing our city around housing affordability and where we go from here. So the way the night is going to work, I put together a short presentation to kick us off that's about the work we've done on a project called Atlanta City Design Housing. And we'll do a quick overview of the work and tell you more about, if you'd like to learn more about it, how to get involved. And then we'll get into some of the specific policies that we're working on right now and hoping to move forward with soon. And then I'll kick it over to Stephanie for her to start a conversation with Joel and Tim about these topics. And we'll go from there. If you've got questions throughout the night, feel free to drop them in the chat. Carolina Rodriguez and Kendra Taylor are helping with technical related stuff. So if you got issues there, you can do a direct message to them. If you got questions, topic related questions, just drop them in the chat to everyone. And Stephanie or I or someone else will try and catch it and make sure that it gets asked tonight. So with that, I will go ahead and jump in and we'll get things started. So I don't know, maybe I'm not a host right now. Someone could potentially make me a co-host. That would be great. It's not letting me screen share. So this is Zoom mistake number 2 of the night. We'll have to keep count.
You should be able to share now.
Looks like that's working. All right. All right, we'll jump right in. So Atlanta City Design Housing is a project that was released toward the end of 2020, and really is a culmination of 2+ years, dating back to the summer of 2018, of community engagement, and asking critical questions about the state of housing in Atlanta, what's working, what's not working, how we got here, and what we can do to make it work better, and ensure that into the future, Atlanta is a place that anyone who wants to call the city home, regardless of income, has the opportunity to do so. So end of 2020, we released this project. It's on a platform called Esri Story Maps, which is an interactive web-based platform. And this is the link to the full story map that gets into a lot more detail, especially in the history and some of the data around this work. That if you're intrigued and haven't had a chance to check it out, I encourage you to go to after tonight's session. So why now? Why are we talking about housing affordability, and specifically thinking about zoning changes and the way to address zoning and the kind of exclusionary paths? One, the city is growing significantly. I'll show a graph here shortly, but in the last decade, we've seen some of the most significant growth in the city's history. And that increased population is putting a lot of pressure on our housing supply. And we need to increase our supply to meet the demand of a growing population. Also learned during the process of this work and during the kind of historic research that there's a lot of exclusionary and discriminatory practices that were baked into the zoning code that still exist today. And we believe that needs to be addressed immediately, and not something that we can wait to address. We've also seen a shift in recent decades in household composition. Households are smaller and changing in sizes. At the same time, there's also different use of space, and I think COVID revealed this in a lot of ways, but the largest percentage of 18 to 29-year-olds living with their parents of any time in the last 100 years. So as households change, household composition changes, flexibility in our zoning code is important so that we're able to develop the kinds of housing that families and households across the city need. So a quick run through the history, and this is going to be a very fast one. I encourage you to go look at the story map if you're interested in learning more about this side of the work. about 80 years ago, the city had a population density of around 8,500 people per square mile. So this is 1940. And that's comparable to modern day Baltimore or Seattle for comparison. But by the time we got to 2018, the city had a population density of around 3,500 people per square mile, less than half, significantly less than half of what we had in 1940. And so when we were working through history of the city and trying to figure out how we got to the housing affordability challenge, this number stuck out to us quite a bit, trying to understand how did we become a city that was less dense over time, even as we grew in population. Also learned, for a bit of context, our population density that we currently have in Atlanta puts us at 316th on the list of most densely populated cities in the United States. We're the least densely populated major U.S. city. And so looking through how we got here and trying to better understand that, we came to the zoning code and found a lot of really interesting things in the city of Atlanta zoning code and our history of zoning and the way that zoning allows for a certain amount of density or doesn't allow for that density and the impact that it has on housing affordability. Probably the most interesting zoning event in the last 100 years for the city is the adoption of the 1929 zoning code. So in 1929, the city passes its first ever zoning code. It was the second, maybe third attempt to pass a comprehensive zoning code in the city. The two previous attempts, one in the 19-teens and one in the early 1920s, both used a racialized zoning code and with an attempt to use the zoning code itself to racially segregate the city. But due to a Supreme Court ruling in the late 19-teens, 1917, I believe it was, that struck down racialized zoning code, that these attempts at doing racially segregated zoning were struck down by the courts. So by the time we get to 1929, the city has abandoned its attempts to use zoning as a proxy for racial segregation and moves toward a type-based zoning code, very similar to what we have today. And the code starts looking at ways to separate use types and residential and different types of residential as a proxy in many ways for class discrimination, which was also used along the same lines that the racialized zoning code existed. So in the red areas here on the map, these are the apartment house areas. And these areas had your smaller style apartment buildings for the most part. And this is the first time the city says that, oh, well, those need to be separated out from the orangish yellow area, which were it was called dwelling houses at the time. These are 2-family and below. So your duplex by right and below. It's important to note that in 29, there was no single family zoning in the city. The duplexes were allowed by right everywhere in the city. But this is an important point in time where apartments and single family begin to separate. And this was done really as a proxy saying that apartments are where lower income residents live, and we want to separate that from higher income residents. And the lower density land use allowed for that to happen. At the same time, this still allowing duplexes by right, rather than just single family, allowed for a lot more density than what the city has today. Because as we'll see, that we continue to move down this road of lower and lower density in the city. And this was in large part because larger lot sizes, lower density, single family detached structures are often costlier to construct, costlier to live in, costlier to maintain. And so this is a function of class discrimination by making it more and more expensive to live in the city for an average household. This is a kind of a typical looking 2-family style dwelling that existed in the 1920s, 30s, 40s in the city. This is a single family type main dwelling unit on the top with a basement apartment here that has a side entrance. Really inconspicuous, fits well within kind of our traditional single family type neighborhoods that we see today. And these are the type of apartments that were constructed really all over the city, and then after 29 start to be constricted only to the areas that were red in the map that we saw before, that are smaller, your 8, 12, 16 unit sometimes apartment buildings that fit in pretty well next to single family houses. By the time we get to the 1930s, the federal government steps in and plays a significant role in shaping the future of housing in America, and does so through creating a federally backed mortgage program. Most of you are familiar with the FHA. So the FHA and another federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is responsible for creating redlining, together create a whole system of wealth creation through the home mortgage. And this system is designed to do a few things, but one is really what it does is it creates a world of single family homes as like the primary way of using wealth creation, and undermines, and really, I guess undermines probably not the right word, reinforces segregation by using things like deed restrictions and other types of mechanisms of racial discrimination, and prioritizing those and only giving out loans in neighborhoods that were racially segregated, and only giving loans most of the time to white communities that are racially segregated that were single family zones. So this reinforcing idea of single family detached structures as a wealth creation tool for white communities, and then at the same time cutting off Black and brown communities, immigrant communities, and apartment house areas from this wealth creation tool, and it creates this disinvestment and lack of wealth creation opportunity through the federal government programs of the New Deal era, while creating a new tool for wealth creation in these newly developed single family type areas in the city. So this reinforces a lot of the work that was done in the zoning codes in the 1920s and 30s by creating a class, kind of a proxy for class and race discrimination at the same time. All of this coming back to zoning, by the time we get to 82, the city has really embraced a lot of this idea of low density zoning and single family typology. And so the 82 zoning code, and this is what we have still today, around 60% of our city is zoned exclusively for single family housing. And the types of housing like the basement apartment that I just showed you were cut out of that opportunity and no longer allowed. And this is in some ways almost this kind of further down zoning. From 1929, we allowed the two family, but by the time we get to 82, what we have today, we don't even allow the two family, or the more subtle type of low density that tends to be more affordable adjacent to single family homes. Another factor that I believe is really important in all of this is the change in population from 1970 to 2019 in the city. With the zoning code that we just saw that has a large amount of single family zoning, part of what enabled that to work and allow Atlanta to stay affordable during that time period is the city saw a significant population decline for a number of factors, including white flight and suburbanization, and there's a whole lot there to unpack. But the loss in population, one of the things that was significant about that is that the limited housing supply that a single family zoning creates was not as much of an issue for a city that had a shrinking population. So we lost about 100,000 residents over the course of 2 decades. We're relatively stagnant from 1990 to 2010, but since 2010, we've gained nearly 100,000 residents at this point, with some of the early estimates coming out for 2020, and have now hit the highest population in the city's history. That growth, that significant growth in such a short amount of time, has put a lot of pressure on our housing supply market, and it's forced us to ask real critical questions about, does the land use we have, the zoning code we created in 1982, work for a city that's growing so significantly in population? And the challenge that in many ways it creates is one around an inelastic housing supply market. So if a healthy housing market is one that's able to create enough housing supply to meet the demand, it looks like one on our right, where prices may go up, but they go up more slowly because we're able to create enough housing to meet the demand of the market. But a restrictive housing supply, much like what we have going on in Atlanta, the lack of supply drives up the cost of housing much faster than it would otherwise, and begins to price people out of the market at a fast rate. And in studies that have been done across the country, across the largest metro areas in the country, areas with the most restrictive housing supply markets are the ones that are more likely to see lower cost units filter up or become more affordable than cities where the housing supply kept up pace with demand. So this is something that happens across the income spectrum, that everything gets slightly more affordable because there's not enough housing supply to meet people at their own income level. So they, folks looking for housing that is affordable and attainable to them find that housing and push out people lower down in the income spectrum and make the whole market less affordable. In just the last decade, the city of Atlanta has seen a 50% increase in the median home sale price for for-sale housing. At the same time, we've seen a significant rise in or redistribution in many ways of rental units by cost in the city. The pink that you see is 2010 rental units broken down by cost in these cost thresholds. And the orange or the goldish color is your 2019. This is inflation adjusted, so the 2010 numbers are in 2019 dollars. What I think is most interesting about this is the significant bump in $1,500 units and above, and really $1,200 units and above. While we're losing market, share at the lower units, we're gaining a lot of high-income units, and it's creating a bit of an imbalance in the market. So we're not creating the kinds of units that we need to create and the typology of units that we need to create to keep the city affordable. And we believe that part of the challenge here is the lack of variety of housing options that are coming to the market. This is a graph showing the number of units in a given housing structure. So single family housing is your pink line, the top here, that's the majority of housing units that we still have in the city. You have a cluster at the bottom of a couple different colors. And those are your smaller apartment buildings, your 5-unit, your 12-unit, your 30-unit buildings. And then you have the blue chart in the middle. This is your 50+ unit apartment buildings. This is where the majority of our new housing stock is coming. And most of that is your 1,500 and above units that you saw in the last graph. This is the kind of housing we're creating in Atlanta, single family homes, large apartment buildings, and not much else. And the not much else is a real issue because that historically, for the history of the city and across many cities in the US and the world, these small apartment buildings, your meager duplex, your basement apartment, your 8-unit building, this is where non-subsidized affordable housing tends to exist in cities. So us not creating that in the market right now is causing a lot of problems in the market. And to go back to this for a second, that's your middle share of housing typology that we're not creating anymore. And we think a lot of that has to do with the way the zoning code allows or doesn't allow certain housing typologies. So as we think about the types of change that we need in the city today, we believe that one, it needs to be specific to Atlanta's needs and the unique development pattern of the city. And on the right, you'll see an image that talks about these are from Atlanta City Design. And in the story map that I mentioned being a call, we get into a lot more detail on what these are. But really thinking about the city and the traditional growth pattern that the city has had and the future growth and where that growth makes sense. Really looking at growth areas, the pinkish areas here, are the areas where a lot of growth can happen. High density growth, high intensity growth along transportation corridors near the urban core and clusters like the Greenbrier Mall area or in Midtown. This is where a lot of its growth can happen. And in corridors like Memorial Drive or Campbellton Road, this growth can also serve the more residential areas around it. But there's this other swath of the city that we call conservation areas. And this swath of the city is where most of the urban tree canopy exists in Atlanta and where most of the single family housing that we do have and smaller style housing we have exists in the city. These areas, we think, need to participate in growth, but need to do so in subtle ways, gentle ways that look more like a modest basement apartment than a large apartment building. And so a lot of these policies are looking at how do we allow that area to grow as the city grows in population, but to grow in ways that are commensurate with the neighborhoods themselves. We also think it's important that we have housing at various price points in every neighborhood, that we create mixed income communities. And one of the challenges of single family zoning and not allowing different options like accessory units in them is that we don't have various price points in neighborhoods. General density, like we're talking about, tends to support neighborhood scale commercial, so the small commercial nodes that exist throughout the city. Most of them exist in areas that had greater density at one point and we've downzoned it, that make it really hard on the small businesses that operate there. We also think it's important to have an opt-in model, a model that's market-based and not subsidized. We have subsidized housing plays a significant role in affordable housing and always will. But we need more than just that if we're going to solve our housing supply issues and our housing affordability issues in the city. We also think it's important to decentralize the wealth creation tool and allow regular everyday homeowners to participate in the growth of the city and to create wealth off of it. and to take pressure off of middle income housing, that also, and doing so, that takes a lot of pressure off of our lower income housing as well, and allows our subsidy to go to lower income housing specifically. A couple quick updates on progress so far. One, earlier this year, we passed a Westside Park Affordability District. This is near the new Westside Quarry Park. And the goal of this is to put affordability requirements in areas where there's major public investment. And so we're excited to see this pass. It includes requirements for both rental and for sale affordability in and around the Westside Quarry Park. We're also working on an update to our Urban Enterprise Zone program. This is a tax abatement tool that we just got approval through the state, and working through the local ordinance updates to it that will allow us to use this tool citywide to create affordable housing, dedicated subsidized affordable housing in the city. We're also working to leverage public land for development of affordable housing, retaining ownership of the land in a way that allows us to keep it affordable over time and ensure that that the vacant public land that we do have can be created for public good. And then we're doing a lot of public engagement on the zoning proposals, which is part of what we'll be talking about tonight. The last thing I'll mention that we made some nice progress on is our Housing Innovation Lab. So this is something we've been working on for the last couple of years. And we are currently in the process of looking for a team to build out that will help us with our housing innovation work. So if you know anyone that might be interested in that, so please reach out to me because we are actively looking for candidates for that role. Okay, so we'll jump into proposals now. I have three quick ones that I'll talk about, and then I'm going to kick it over to Stephanie. So proposal number one is affordable housing density bonus near transit. So small apartment buildings near transit, you know, as I mentioned a couple times, they're once a big part of the city's housing stock and played a significant role in it and existed throughout the city, but they've kind of increasingly been zoned out and made harder to build in the city. They tend to fit in well near single family areas while allowing slightly more density. And this is, we think, is especially important near transit. They tend to be more affordable. They're smaller units, they take up less space, the land cost is distributed over more units. So it allows for the units to be more affordable than, say, a single family home or even a duplex that may be on the side. By putting them near transit, we believe we can reduce car dependency patterns in the city, which we know is a generational kind of change that we'll have to work through, but think is an important step in the right direction. And so what the ordinance itself, what would it do? So there are a couple of things, and forgive me, I'm going to get in the weeds a little bit here. Hopefully I don't get too wonky on you, so please ask me for clarification at Q&A if you have any questions on these. So the first is changes to a zoning district called MRMU. This was something created in 2018 during the zoning quick fix work to allow 4 to 12 unit structures in the city. So we've had, one of the challenges we've run into with this is that originally it allowed 4 to 12 units. We think it's important to change that to 1 to 12 units because it fits well in single family areas and think about rezoning. We want to make sure that if someone has a single family home or a duplex, and it gets rezoned to MRMU, that it's not a non-conforming use, which is something where it makes it difficult to do updates otherwise in the zoning code. So changing that to 1 to 12, we think gives more flexibility. The other thing that we are hoping to do with the MRMU is to update to allow multiple structures on the site. So development patterns like a cottage court, maybe a development pattern you've seen before where there's like 8 or 10, maybe 6 small houses, tiny home type things that face inward on a courtyard, or you think 2 4-unit structures. Allowing that we think would make this work a little bit better and just provide flexibility for different sites and different needs on a given property. And the other thing that we want to do here is to create what we're calling an affordable housing density bonus. So in the area 1/2 mile from a MARTA station, this is just a radius. This will actually be done in a walk shed, basically like only how you could walk to the MARTA station. So if there's let's say a train line or otherwise they cut you off, this would not impact that. Only the walking area is what this would impact. But the density bonus would allow for an increase of up to 8 or 12 units. So if you could do like, let's say 2 units by right on the lot, you could go up to 8 units if you provided a certain amount of affordable housing, or 12 units if you provide a little more affordable housing. This would allow us to create the small apartments again in a way that fits with the transit-oriented style development, but to require affordability in all the new development that exists there. And so we think that requiring affordability, and especially requiring it near transit, is helpful for our affordability goals, but also from a resident that lives in one of the units, you know, the ability to live without a car in Atlanta reduces the cost of living as well. We think that's really important. So the second proposal is about parking requirements. So parking, minimum parking requirements exist in many US cities, and Atlanta is no exception, and require in the zoning code that a certain amount of parking must be related to a given dwelling unit or retail use or otherwise. This can be quite challenging for a number of reasons. One is that it reinforces a car dependency pattern in the city. It says, we can only build in a way that relies on cars. If someone doesn't own a car, they still play a role in the subsidizing of car ownership and the reinforcing of car dependency patterns in the city. It also is I think it's important to think about disaggregating the cost of owning a car and cost of parking from the cost of housing. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do here. For reference, the cost of parking for a new multifamily development can cost somewhere from 18 to 20% of the total cost. And that to the tune of about $40,000 per parking space. And if you run those numbers out over 15, 20 years, that's about $125 a month that gets added to rent, or $4 a day for residents. And that money is not something the developers just eat, they pass that cost down. And so as long as we require parking in our zoning code, we're reinforcing the idea that parking should be tied to housing, and it ends up raising the cost of housing for someone, whether they own a car or not. So the ordinance itself, what would it do? It would remove all residential parking requirements in primary zoning districts throughout the city. And we would maintain all non-residential uses for the purposes of this. So there's a commercial parking requirement or a retail parking requirement. Those are going to stay in place right now. We really want to focus this work on affordable housing and trying to decouple the cost of parking from housing. We'll keep the parking requirements that do exist in SVIs and other special districts. Those are often neighborhood levels, and spent a lot of time thinking about what made sense for those neighborhoods, and we're going to leave those alone for this update. And then where there are existing parking maximums, those will stay in place, and only will deal with parking minimum requirements. The third proposal is about accessory dwelling units. So accessory dwelling units, or second units kind of more broadly, going back to even the 1929 zoning code we talked about, have long been a part of the city's development pattern historically. And in the single family areas that we have in the city today, there are about 2,400 of those, a little over 2,400 2 and 3 family properties in those areas because of the historic pattern and the way we've developed the city. Top neighborhoods include Atkins Park and Virginia Highland, Grove Park, West End, and really all throughout the city, we see elements of this in our zoning code. And it's important, I think, to understand that this is not something new and radical, but something we allowed for a very long time and somewhat recently stopped allowing, and still exists in many areas. And so part of what our goal is just to regulate that and allow it again and allow it to function as it historically has as an affordable option for people. For a little national context, the state of Georgia is actually #2 in the country in attached ADUs. We'll talk briefly in a second about what attached and detached accessory dwelling units are. But this is, again, I think reinforces this idea. This has long been something that existed in and around Atlanta. And we're hoping to make it, really bring it to the front and center as a tool that can be a part of the work we're doing on affordable housing. So detached ADUs and attached ADUs. So a detached accessory dwelling unit is like what exists here on your left. So this accessory dwelling is what we passed in 2018 in the zoning quick fix. It's a separate structure from the main dwelling unit that exists in the backyard. Max square footage allowed in Atlanta is 750 square feet. We currently allow this in R4, R4A, and R5 zoning districts in the city, which is a good chunk of our single family areas. This is a helpful zoning and is one that's increasingly used, but it has some limitations. It can be quite costly, and some sites it just doesn't really work on. On the right is what's called an attached accessory dwelling unit. This is maybe something more traditional to think about. This is your basement apartment or your addition on the back of a home. maybe a side entrance to a second unit. This is a part of the main dwelling, but kind of a subsidiary or a secondary type of unit that tends to be there. They tend to be smaller than the main dwelling and a lot cheaper to live in than the main single family house that they operate in. So with Atlanta only allowing the detached ADUs and not the attached ADUs, we spent a lot of time, trying to figure out, does that work? Are we comparable to other cities, and what can we do to make ADUs work better in Atlanta? One thing we learned in looking at the city of Los Angeles is that detached ADUs, or LA calls them backyard homes, make up the smallest share of the ADU development that they're seeing in the city. The majority of the development they're seeing are conversions and conversions plus additions. So like, think of an expansion on the back of your home. And this is often because, and we spent some time talking with them, they're cheaper to build, they're easier to get permitted, they're easier to get financed, they make a lot more sense to folks, and sometimes it just works better on your lot. You don't have to cut down a tree, or you don't have to, because it's in the existing space. But right now, we're not allowing that in Atlanta. And so we think that allowing these attached ADUs, these conversions, is an important step in the right direction. The other thing that we found really interesting in looking at ADUs in LA is that the majority of the ones that are being built are built by owner builders. And we found this to be true in the smaller amount that we've had it built in Atlanta as well. And this is really a tool that can be good for homeowners, that regular everyday homeowners have the opportunity to generate wealth and to use their properties in ways that work for them. And this is more of a tool for regular homeowners than it is for contractors, at least, and that's what we're seeing in many cities. So the benefits of expanding ADUs in Atlanta, it provides a moderate income housing option that's not subsidized in the city. So these may not be a 30% AMI dedicated affordable housing unit, but they tend to fit that gap that we were talking about in the rental housing market earlier on, where we're not creating enough units. And ADUs can create a lot of those units all throughout the city in a really decentralized type of way, allowing them attached to make them more affordable to construct, as I mentioned. And then creating a variety of price points in single family neighborhoods, so that let's say it's a $600,000 single family house, the ADU, whether it's a backyard ADU or a garage conversion, is going to be much more affordable than the $600,000 single family home that's in. And then it gives homeowners an opportunity to financially benefit from the growing city. We estimate that around 11,500 new housing units will be created if current single family properties added an ADU. So the ordinance itself, what would it do? So the first thing that we want to change would be to allow ADUs to be attached to the main dwelling. This would be a size restricted unit. We're looking at something like 50% of the main dwelling structure, but allowing the attached ADU, I think, is maybe the most significant change we're hoping to make here, and really fits in line with how ADUs have expanded across the country. We want to increase the height of ADUs. This is for detached ADUs. From 20 feet to 24 feet. Right now it's 20 feet in the areas that they're allowed. By moving it to 24 feet, it would allow for a more traditional second floor development pattern. So if you wanted to take up less space and go vertical instead, you could make that happen with 2 floors, or do a unit over garage type of build out. We'll get a lot of requests for that, but 20 feet is just not great for it right now. The other for us would be to expand ADU allowance to all our districts. I mentioned the ones that it's allowed in right now. We think expanding these throughout the city is a great next step. Also make some adjustments to the rear and side setbacks. We did this in the R5, which is one of the single family, 2-family districts, but expanding that in the R4s just to make them work a little bit better and configure lots better, we think could be really helpful. Considering potentially a restriction around ability to use ADUs for short-term rentals. Our goal here is creating affordable housing, so short-term rentals can make that a little bit of a hairy situation and really not accomplish this goal. So we've been listening to a lot of folks, and this is one thing that we're strongly considering. We're also looking at a potential mechanism that would allow ADUs to be available for sale in some districts. A for sale ADU would create a more affordable ownership opportunity for homeowners instead of just an affordable rental, and could just give flexibility to homeowners that want to capitalize their property and be able to make some money off of it rather than be property managers with a rental. This is likely not something that would happen in all districts in the city, but we are looking at a couple that we may introduce this in. And then the last thing would be to expand the total unit allowance in R5 zoning district. So R5, for those that are not super familiar with the city zoning code, this is the only two-family zoning district. So similar to the 1929 code, this is the only district in the city where you can do duplexes by right now. But we have a 2-unit max, so you can build an ADU or you can build a duplex, but currently you can't build an ADU and a duplex. So we're looking to expand the R5 district to allow a duplex plus ADU style configuration in that district. So the last thing I'll say, thanks. Well, first off, thanks for being here tonight and being involved in this. Over the next few months, this is likely to move forward through a legislative process. And when it does, it will go to your local MPU. And that's where it'll be voted on and make recommendations for your neighborhood. So if you care about this and feel strongly about it, that's where you can go and be civically involved in the decision-making process and recommendations on how the city moves these things forward. So go get involved in your MPU, share it with your friends on social media. And if there's anyone that you think needs to hear this that didn't today, or a group that you would like for us to present to or meet with, please reach out to me or anyone on the team, and we can find some time to meet with them. We're happy to meet with anybody who wants to talk about this stuff. So with that, that's me, and I will stop there. And Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Hello. Great. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. I think first I'll say I'm really happy to be here. I think I'm supposed to also say that I am just here to help people understand these policies and do not endorse them because I'm a journalist. So, I want to start actually with this question in the chat from Paul McMurray about Buckhead, because I think that's—
Stephanie, real quick, before you jump in, can we just have you and Tim and Joel do a quick intro as well?
Yeah, of course.
Before you jump into all the questions.
Yeah, I was just so excited about this comment. Yeah. So yeah, of course, we have Joel Dixon of Urban Oasis Development. He's here to provide us with the developer's perspective, and then Commissioner Tim Keene, who has been with us shaping the city for several years now.
And Stephanie, if I can hop in here, because Joel Dixon, co-principal with Urban Oasis Development, we do commercial and residential real estate development. I'm actually was raised here in Atlanta, grew up in the old John Hope University homes, which was the oldest public housing project in the country for Black people. Techwood was at that time segregated for whites only. I now live about 1.5 miles from that area. And I also did not come from a real estate background. So as I talk about a lot of the conversation today, it's coming first as a citizen, as a resident, as somebody who's lived and grown up in Atlanta and actually left the technology sector because I wanted to see our city be more intentional about how we were going to handle growth and progress. And so this is something that for me begins and ends with the fact that I was a resident, am a citizen, but also the need to have somebody that would be proactive about doing development is the reason why I definitely had to hop into residential and commercial development as a trade, because if we don't do it, sometimes we can't look to others. We have to say, hey, maybe it's us, or maybe it's me that needs to be doing the work. And so I do want to introduce that, because a lot of times real estate developer or just developer period is a 4-letter word. And I understand the reasons why, but the context that I'm coming from is maybe a bit different from what others are typically exposed to. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, going into this, I was really thinking about some of the stories that have come out, and even with these small zoning changes, these concerns that that the city would like to turn Atlanta into something it's not. So I thought that would be a great starting point, Commissioner Keene, if that's okay, to talk about why these solutions, these last 3 specifically that we were just introduced to, why those are suited to Atlanta specifically.
Well, I'll try to answer this briefly and listen more to Joel, but it's an important question, and all of this work stems from, as Josh said, Atlanta City Design, which we finished in late 2017. City Council included it in the city charter at that time, and that design for Atlanta is about the city growing in ways that are characteristic of this place, not borrowing things from other places and making this some kind of different place, but actually understanding the physical characteristics of Atlanta and how can we grow as a city like we never have, but commensurate with this physical place. And what Josh just outlined in terms of our recommendations is completely of this place. I mean, he's talking about how do we get some additional housing in these large multifamily or single family areas that we have. We're not proposing to change single family or eliminate it. We're looking for ways to, as he said, subtly add units within the single family areas. Can you imagine 11,500 units if only 15% of the single family homes in Atlanta added a second unit? 11,500, that's a big number. As a comparison, the big bond issue that we're going to do in association with subsidy for affordable housing that's been so much in the news and much debated, that would generate something like 3,000 units. This enormous effort to somehow publicly subsidize units will result in 3,000. If only 15% of our single family homes added a second unit, that's 11,500 units in the city. These are not trivial numbers. And the idea that we have to spend public money to subsidize units that the private market should be able to produce, you know, we're going to spend public money to subsidize housing for people making 80 to 100% of area median income. There's no way we should have to do that. We should unlock the potential of this specific place for the private market to produce those units. And this is one way to do that. There should be others, but to be clear, Stephanie, and I think, you know, parts of the city, Buckhead in particular, you mentioned Buckhead, saw this as some kind of attack on single family. It's not that at all. This is the opposite of that. This is reinforcing the importance of maintaining what makes Atlanta, Atlanta, which includes single family. And we're not proposing build high-rise apartment buildings in single family, not even duplexes and triplexes. We're saying, how can we do this in a single family way and somehow affect that 63% of the city that single family is owned? So that was longer than I thought. But Joel, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Appropriate in Atlanta?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, with, you know, once again, the conversation and noting the conversation in Buckhead, I think that it's important to understand that we're residents, we're all citizens. You know, I call us all neighbors. From my perspective, I think that it is one that really, you know, reading across the supporter report, AJC, you know, there's constantly this narrative that always wants to put things in a box. And I think one of the boxes that is that Tim was just referring to is that box that this is an attack on single family housing. I live in a single family house. I'm a big proponent of single family housing. I'm a big proponent of ownership. Nothing in the Atlanta city design nor in the work that we've been trying to do is in contradiction to single family zoning. So I think that that can't be shouted on the rooftops enough. I do think, however, that when we talk about the neighborhoods that exist today, we have to understand that those neighborhoods also came from a period of time where it was not only single family housing that was in those neighborhoods or was allowed in those neighborhoods, which is why not only single family housing exists today, in spite of the changes across the time period that Josh mentioned of zoning changes. So there's a whole bunch of stuff, right, that is now non-conforming because it was built prior to those changes. But as we try to protect neighborhoods, and I hear this a lot from, you know, Buckhead, you know, down to the south side, east side, to west side, is that we have to understand the neighborhoods we're protecting existed before us. I live in historic Adair Park, a neighborhood that dates to the early, you know, 1920s, adjacent to historic West End, which dates even earlier. And the product of housing there was significantly more diverse in terms of the type of housing that was inclusive of single family housing and inclusive of other type of housing. And so I do think that it's important to understand that this stuff can not only did coexist does coexist and could continue to coexist even if we created more of it without it being detrimental to the preservation of neighborhoods. And I think it's also an important one to say that, you know, in the comments related to Buckhead, and once again, I don't live in Buckhead. I've been in Atlanta forever. I've seen Buckhead unfold. I have lived periodically and worked in Buckhead. But I do think that it is important to have the conversation from everybody. You know, I think that the comments that are being noted are important, but I think that if the discussion is truly open, then there will be a better understanding of what, you know, the Atlanta City Design Plans and some of the proposed changes are actually looking to accomplish. And if they can be better framed or better adjusted for certain needs, for certain neighborhoods, you know, I think that that's an open conversation. And my final point, though, is also going to be the one thing we can't do, though, is stick our head in the sand and ignore the pace of growth and the change of Atlanta. So no matter what occurred in the 1920s, 1930s, 1980s, what's happening now and in the future is significant growth unlike any we've ever seen before. If we do decide in any neighborhood in the city of Atlanta that we're just going to stick our heads in the sand and preserve neighborhoods by not allowing for a certain amount of flexibility, then we're going to unfortunately reap the rewards of that, which is one, the traffic that all Atlantans who have been here for any period of time saw be created as a result of the sprawl of Atlanta in the 80s and the 90s. Well, guess what? That's just going to continue into the city limits. But we're also going to see the rest of the dysfunctionality of a city that tries to stick its head in the sand, which is unaffordability, which to some people may be irrelevant. But guess what? That unaffordability is the reason why Microsoft left and is moving here, their HQ to. It's the reason why Google and Amazon are all looking to replace here, because they literally can't find housing for people that they're hiring in the West Coast. So if we do want to go the same route as the West Coast and the cities that I just mentioned, by all means, let's stick our head in the sand. But if we want to be intentional and do it better and do it the right way, the great thing is that Atlanta has a tremendous canvas on which to do it, and to do it in a model that preserves nature and conservation and preservation of our canopy, while also, more importantly, preserving access for people to have housing in the city.
Joel, I was curious if you could share any examples from your work, examples of how maybe you were limited by the current zoning and why you are supporting these changes now.
Yes, Stephanie, absolutely. Like I said, a lot of my conversation starts with, you know, I'm a neighbor. And so I'll just give you an example. I told you that I live about 1.5 miles from where I grew up. And so I live in historic Adair Park. Me and my wife purchased, you know, several years ago. And I used the example of my specific street. On my street, historically, there was about 29 units of housing. It was at the time, of course, zoned such that 2-family residential was the, you know, kind of minimum. So there were a lot of duplexes. There were single family, there were quads. At the end of my street happens to be a school that recently was converted. And so when we purchased here, that was kind of how it existed in certain ways. But I will say that from, you know, 1980 to even to when we were purchasing, there was a loss of 21% of housing units, which is to some people insignificant, losing, you know, 7, 8, 9 households. But on a single street, if we multiply that across streets across Atlanta, it becomes very significant. So that's lost housing. In addition, the duplexes that remain on my street are non-conforming. So essentially anybody that purchases those and tries to get a building permit for any purpose is going to have to transfer that into a single family home, regardless of whether they want to or not. Like, this is the legal aspect of things. And so that's going to, at this point, not only eliminate units, but also increase unaffordability, because my street has gone from a house that I purchased for, you know, essentially $230,000 several years ago to now being, you know, underwritten at $400,000+ just 3-4 years down the road. So anybody that converts that, that's what now the new price is going to be. And of course, the resultant rent aspect. And so this is how I started better understanding this issue, is just looking at my street, looking at my neighborhood and seeing that replicated, because we'd already seen it happen in Eastlake and Kirkwood and Reynoldstown and Old Fourth. So seeing it though real time was something that now allowed me to take it from theory to actual application. And so what happens is that unless we're better able to understand the impact of this zoning to real people and to real life, I think we can kind of push it off and say this is a developer issue or this is about money or anything else, but it really is a people issue. And on my street to the present, the thing that has saved us is the 2 quads that are on the street still remain and have still been functioning. Even though we've gotten rid of a lot of the duplexes, at least there are a couple, so that's preserved some. And then with the recent renovation of the old historic Adair Park School to lofts on the street, it actually has now increased affordable rental units on the street. And I say that I have all of this mix of housing on my street, and it has not contributed to an increase in crime. It has not led to greater safety issues. It has certainly not decreased my property values. And I think, and it certainly has not harmed either the tree canopy of the neighborhood. And so as I hear these conversations happen, I just try to give real world examples to say, I understand it and I get it, and fears, perceived or otherwise, are real to any individual. But let's start looking at the real data and looking at the real neighborhoods and the real impact, and at least allow for the opportunity to listen and see if maybe our fears are perceived fears, but not actual. And so that's one of the examples that's on my street level. I will say, not taking off, but putting on the developer hat on top of my neighbor hat, I am, as a developer, able to do projects such as the one that we recently were approved for in the Grove Park area, where we're acquiring 40 plus parcels of land, where we're going to do 60 plus units of housing, of which we're doing it with the land trust as a permanently affordable, a portion as a permanently affordable model for home ownership, as well as also looking to implement the type of missing middle housing, i.e. 2-family residential, attached ADUs, everything that Josh is talking about. And as we spoke to the neighborhoods, the MPUs, the city of Atlanta, and everyone else, they were excited to see us do this type of housing that was going to include affordable housing. But the other thing is that it's also about the numbers of attainable and abundant housing that we can create. And on the same lot that we would have ordinarily only been able to create 1 single family house, to now create 2 residences that can now each be single family and owned, or create a backyard, ADU that can be rented out. This is what unlocks everything that we're asking for, which is right next to Microsoft. How are we going to preserve that neighborhood? How are we going to preserve access to that neighborhood? This is a very easy fix, and it required nothing other than the opportunity and ability to more efficiently utilize the space that we already have.
Thank you for that. Councilmember Amir Faroqi had an op-ed in Supporter Report supporting some of the zoning changes. And one thing he noted I thought was interesting about in Minneapolis, they rezoned for, was it duplexes and triplexes? And he noted that there were only a few applications ultimately in 1 year. Commissioner Keene, I was wondering about that point specifically, because I think that it could make some people feel better that they won't see big changes to their neighborhood, but perhaps it means that we might not see big changes from these policies. What do you think about that?
Well, I think number one, I think we have a very different dynamic in Atlanta when it comes to the market. I think there's the demand here is so high, and I think that we'll see. I mean, we're already seeing, and Joel's gone through some of it, but there's many other examples in the city of people doing ingenious things when it comes to housing, private people doing ingenious things to try to supply housing in a market that the city's never seen. I mean, Josh went through the numbers. We're entering a period of growth in Atlanta. We entered it just a couple of years ago, really, but we're kind of at the forefront of a period of demand in the city that, as Joel said, if we don't address these issues now, we will quickly jump to a completely unaffordable city. And we have this time to do it. So I think the policy changes that we're proposing, and even the small apartment buildings that Josh went through, you know, we created the MRMU zoning back in 2018, but when we created it, it required that anyone that wanted to do it needed to rezone the property in order to do the MRMU, and it's been very difficult for people to do that. So the demand has been there, you know, it's just that we've got to, as a city, find ways to change our zoning such that we enable this creativity and the different people like Joel and others that are trying to find ways to appropriately address the housing supply issue in the city. And zoning is the way to do that. You know, we talk a lot about, and it's important to discuss projects that we're developing through subsidy somehow. You know, the city's using its public subsidy to do these different things. That's clearly critically important. But the way to really address the housing issue in a way that is impactful in the way I think Atlantans expect is through zoning, is to use our zoning in appropriate ways to unlock the potential of the private market to address this issue. And so I think in Atlanta's case, unlike, and I haven't checked on exactly what's happened in Minneapolis with regard to their changes in their comp plan and zoning to see how many have been built, but I think Atlanta's already demonstrated in a tough regulatory environment that the private market is ready to do these things and even withstand long public processes as they exist today to try to get them done. And we want to, it's what we have to do in Atlanta is make the things we want easy to do. And that's a big part of Atlanta city design. And these discussions are healthy. It's good for us to discuss these things. That's why we did it, so that we would be discussing this, because if we don't, we will have lost this opportunity.
A follow-up question to that, Commissioner Keene. Could you put an estimate on how long it might take before we see like a real impact from changes like these even just these 3 proposals that are before us?
A very short period of time. I mean, ideally we get some versions of what Josh presented today approved this calendar year, so that we've got those regulatory changes in place this calendar year, some version of each of those 3 proposals, which are not all our proposals, but there are 3 of them with regard to zoning in place this year. And I think you would see an impact within the first 2 years, a substantial impact. You would see each of the proposals that Josh outlined would have a substantial, noticeable impact in many neighborhoods in the city within a 2-year time frame.
Well, some of the proposals I think leave a lot open to developers, right? So reducing or eliminating parking minimums allows a developer to decide how many parking spaces they would like, right? Or how many units they would like to include in these small apartment buildings. How do you think developers will interpret and use these policies?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, so like the real world and life itself in a diverse set of ways, right? Is, you know, with housing, there's always the opportunity for things to happen in different frameworks, in different ways. I think the benefit of life, and COVID probably showed us this much as anything, is the need to have adaptable and flexible systems in place. Because you don't know what tomorrow holds, and you don't want to limit the ability for the right stuff to happen as soon as possible. And there's so many examples of that from last year and into this year related to COVID. So as I answer that question, I start with that by saying, one, parking is extremely expensive to build. Like it's just a natural part of the cost of a development. even a small scale development, which very much a proponent of incremental small scale development. So this, 2 to 12 units structure, that's really what, I'm a big proponent of. We need to build bigger stuff where appropriate in the right corridors. But when we talk about most of the city, that's not even what I'm a proponent of, right? But even on small developments, I'm doing a project right now in the Capitol View neighborhood. It's going to launch or be a part of helping launch a previously defunct neighborhood corridor. It's going to include what we hope to be the first set of healthy food neighborhood level grocer alongside spaces for small businesses to occupy and 2 additional stories on a building of affordable housing. And the conversation was around parking. So we're in an overlay already within the Beltline that required 0 parking. But just understand that just because that flexibility is there doesn't mean that the reality is that we would build 0 parking. We're going to actually build parking there, but the good thing is that we're not being beholden to some fixed requirement that could be too much parking, that would be unnecessary for the district, for the project, or even what the community wants. So at least now it's being better able to be right sized and efficiently managed. Not to say that we're going from something to 0, but from something that'll be more efficient for the purposes. The fact that it also becomes more affordable because of the lower cost of doing the parking is an additional attribute that once again transitions to the affordability and the attainability of that housing. But I will say that that's the key component, I think, in terms of the proposals around the parking, is that there's still going to be parking, but that it's going to now be more flexibly applied so that it's right size for each project. And at a small scale, that becomes even more important than at these large scale projects, because you don't need always the same amount of housing at an incremental smaller scale level as you might need for a 300 unit apartment, development or mixed or multifamily development. So that's what I would say is exciting about the proposal, is that it does allow for that flexibility from a developer perspective. And I will say the same thing holds for even neighborhood builders. I'm a part of a group, Incremental Development Alliance, that trains individuals in neighborhoods to do their own building. So they're the owner occupants of these neighborhoods who are building a single structure or a single thing. So them also being able to now right size that parking is just as important. We can't always think of this as something that's, for big developers. No, this is something that's about housing. And as Josh showed, a lot of the housing is not always built by your traditional developers. It's being built by individuals.
Joel, how do you think the city, or, I guess I don't know whose role it would be, how could you make sure these policies are acted on, equally throughout the city? Because I know there's always a concern in some neighborhoods where land is cheaper, that they're going to get stuck with all of the apartments or something like that. So could you talk about that?
Absolutely, would love to. Intentionality. The same intentionality we need to have a plan around growth. So regardless of which way we go, we can't just ignore growth. So that same intentionality goes into at the neighborhood level and the zoning level, how that maybe gets applied. So for example, you can have, these density, and I hate to always use the word density bonuses, but you can have these dependent factors depending on what's being developed and how it's being developed, that maybe includes the affordability that then allows for certain types of development, whether it be the housing number, the ADU number, any of that can be dependent on other things. So I do think that it's good to decouple those 2 things to say, hey, it's not just going to be one thing and then that's it. You can make it dependent on other things. I think, though, also the important aspect of the city of Atlanta as it relates to it being spread out across the city. And I saw the mention, and I appreciate Mr. McMurray's comments about it's not just Buckhead, it's Collier Heights, it's, Lakewood Heights, it's all of the neighborhoods also in other areas of the region. And I totally agree. That's the reason why it needs to be comprehensive across all of the neighborhoods of Atlanta. The biggest issue with Atlanta is that growth has always been inequitable. Neighborhood development has been inequitable. That's why certain neighborhoods have everything and the rest of the neighborhoods have nothing. And that's led to unaffordability, because if you look at a house that has 20 rooms in it, where you've made 3 rooms livable and rooms that people want to be in, everybody's going to flock to those 3, and it's going to lead to a lot of dysfunctionality around housing, around affordability, around, schools being packed, all of this stuff, when you have 17 other rooms. So I think the whole point is that, yes, if we make this comprehensive across Atlanta and allow for that housing choice to be developed across Buckhead to Bankhead, or formerly Bankhead, to, Collier Heights, all the way to Lakewood Heights, then that's going to spread out all of this growth. It's going to spread out the opportunities for neighborhoods to actually develop. It's going to increase the number of neighborhoods that we have that people want to actually live in, right? Because they can. And it's also going to decrease a lot of the things that people are talking about, which is destroying canopies, eliminating single family housing, right? Destroying the preservation or the current context of neighborhoods. Guess what? If we spread this thing out, nobody's going to have to bear the burden of it all. But if we try to limit it, yes, that you're going to disproportionately group these things in ways that are not necessary when it comes to the city of Atlanta. I've lived in San Francisco, the Bay Area. I've lived in Los Angeles area. There are other constraints they have that we do not have from a neighborhood perspective. If we will all stand up and say, yes, we're willing to be a part of the solution, not just Buckhead, not just Oak Fourth, not just Reynoldstown, but also not just Grove Park, not just Oakland City, not just historic West End or Dare Park. And so that's what excites me, honestly, is that this is a conversation for all of my neighbors, not just a select few. And I will finally say this, is that there is a very real perception, because I work a lot on the South Side, the West Side, about neighborhoods that are concerned that they're going to get all of the disproportionate amount of bad stuff because other neighborhoods are going to close their doors. And so I don't think that those neighborhoods that are closing their doors perceive that that's what everybody else thinks, but that's what's happening, is that, you're saying, I don't want to be a part of the solution alongside you. I want you to fix the problem and we stay here. And I think that the pain of that is going to be more painful for everybody. Whereas, as my grandmother used to say, many hands in the pot shortens the load, many hands in the work decreases the overall burden. And so I hope that that's what all of my neighbors across all of Atlanta, south to west, or south to north, north to south, east to west, will really take away.
Commissioner Keene, would you like to add to that? And also, since we're running out of time, would you talk about what changes are possible at this point as these policies go through the public input process?
Well, just to finish the discussion that was just happening, I think it's wrong even to think of this as a burden, that somehow some part of the city has a burden to take on here. It's not a burden at all. It's about being in a city, and congratulations, you're in a great city that's growing and getting better every day. And so it's the opposite of a burden. It's who gets the benefits of this growth, really. Who will benefit from this growth the most in this process? And because the region, is growing substantially. We haven't decided that. Tim didn't decide that. Josh didn't decide that. The mayor didn't decide that. The region is growing. This is, to think that it's not, that this is a choice between something and nothing, is just wrong. And so Atlanta City Design was about embracing that and saying, how do you shape that growth such that the city gets better and better and better? And we in Atlanta have a unique opportunity to do that, because the city is going to change substantially. If we can add double the people that we have today, that would be wonderful. If we can get more than that, even better. But do it in a way that is commensurate with the physical characteristics of this place, and essentially do it in a way that enables everyone of all incomes to live here, to work here, to make a life for themselves here, to advance economically, and that's the city that we can be. And so let's share in those benefits and think of these zoning changes as ways that we can equitably share in this amazing prosperity that the city's in the midst of right now. What can be done this year, or what can be achieved? We have been anxious to get legislation to City Council on each of the items that Josh outlined, that what's important, as you know, is that for any of these things to happen, a majority of city council members have to vote yes. And so we have been working hard, meeting with anyone that wants to meet on this. I had a meeting last night on it. And we'll continue to do that and seeking support for each of those three proposals that Josh outlined. And I believe strongly that this year, as I said, we will get versions of each of those three adopted by city council. But we have to have their support, which means we have to have the community's support. And every time we meet with someone, we say, please consider this, because this is a public service announcement. This city is growing. There's nothing that will change that. And we must do things right now to ensure that the city doesn't become dramatically unaffordable. And you think, oh, you're being hyperbolic here. Not at all. We've seen it happen in too many places, but we can address it now. And I think we will this year, Stephanie, get a version of each of those adopted and the best version of each three that we possibly can and get the votes for.
I haven't been keeping close track of some really specific questions in the chat. Josh, have you? Caroline?
I know that Carolina has been working on pulling those together. I don't know if there are any specific questions that pull out. Any Carolina that come to the top?
Yes, let me ask one that was kind of earlier in the thread. And so it asks, would MRMU allow for gentle mixed-use developments like a 2-story building with a grocery store on the first floor and an apartment on the top?
MRMU does not permit that. And the proposal around small apartment buildings going from 1 to 12 within that half mile of the MARTA stations in neighborhoods. We have MARTA stations downtown. Obviously, this doesn't apply to every MARTA station, but the ones that would be relevant within our neighborhoods, those are strictly residential, so they don't include non-residential. I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. That would make it harder to get done this year, I would suspect, but they're strictly residential as conceived so far.
One note I might add on that too is, we haven't talked about it a ton tonight, but we're also working on a larger zoning rewrite that's going to look at a lot of things, including separation of uses. And I think that's something that exists throughout the city, is like our residential and commercial and other uses are all very separated in the existing zoning code. And so I think that's something that absolutely we should consider. How do we intermix uses? Historically in the city, we had better intermingling of uses than we do in our current zoning code. But this specific ordinance would not change that. But I think it's an important consideration, one that merits a lot more conversation.
I did see, and I don't know if there's some other questions, but I saw several questions that were all related to kind of affordability, ADUs, zoning, and also the type of housing, whether it be 2-family, triplexes, other things. I'd love to comment on that if there is time. Okay, I'll take that as a—
we have about 12 more minutes, Joel, so go for it.
Okay, great. Because I think they are all very interrelated and very relevant. So one, as it relates to affordability and the aspect, a lot of people talk about density and group density within affordability, and there are concerns. I've heard them, I've read about them, that density doesn't automatically ensure affordability. And this is what I say is that, nothing ensures anything, right? And so I don't disagree with that. I think that saying that automatically density is going to create affordability, if you try to look at it as just black and white, maybe that's not the right way. I think the better aspect, though, is to understand that density definitely allows for relative affordability and enables for affordability in ways that otherwise would not be there. And so rather than an all or nothing, which once again, I feel like these conversations are either we're always going to get affordability if we do this, or we're never going to get affordability. That's not really the conversation when it comes to housing choice and let's say ADUs or two-family residential. It's the fact that today, even if I wanted to create something that was affordable, myself, 20 other neighbors, 10 other nonprofit developers, 100 for-profit developers, even if they wanted to create that kind of affordability, they could not. So this is the age-old, do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? I understand everybody's comments on each side. I would say I'm willing to accept the fact that not all density is going to create all affordability, with the understanding that I know the amount of density that it will create a lot more affordability than what will come if we do nothing at all. Secondarily, as it talked about property management and the type of housing, so in neglected neighborhoods, whether it's duplexes, triplexes, MRMU gets implemented, I think a lot of times people think about housing type related to safety, crime, and all of this stuff, and it's not housing type. I grew up in, the middle of the projects, but also in the middle of a lot of single family housing around me, like historic Adair Park, English Avenue, Vine City, like all of these places are historic single family residential. And they didn't have trap duplexes. They had trap houses, for those who are familiar with the terms. Like, bad stuff can come out of any type of housing that's not being properly managed, whether it's a single family or not. And so I think that it's kind of not the right question to say if we build more density that we're increasing the amount of absentee landlords or the type of bad neglected housing. I think the thing is that we need to do a better job across all of our housing, including single family that currently exists, on monitoring, on code enforcement, and ensuring that property owners are doing the right things. I do still believe in human nature and in Atlantans to do the right thing overall with the housing as it's created in ways that historically has not been. And I have the same conversation with my neighbors who have grown up in neighborhoods where two-family residential and duplexes and tries were neglected and poorly property managed. And that's literally the reason why they got rid of it in those neighborhoods, is not because of the housing type. It was just because they saw too much of it being bad. But nobody got rid of single-family residential, even though there was just as much bad stuff being done out of single-family houses. So I would just add that to the conversation. And then the final thing as it relates to the affordability piece, we've done several projects to pilot this stuff over the last several years. So I don't want you all to think, once again, I'm promoting stuff just off of a whim. We started piloting this stuff in 2016. I did a basement level apartment in a Westview neighborhood Westview house that had a basement, single family house. And I showed for the first time, I was like, this neighborhood at the time, it was like a high 100,000, low $200,000 neighborhood. I said Westview is going to be a $400,000 neighborhood in 2.5 years. But this is a way, if we take this, convert the basement to this apartment style, even if somebody purchases it today, they'll be able to enable that basement level apartment for housing, rental housing, or otherwise, in a way that will be more affordable than what would end up happening if it's just a single family house. We did that there. We did it 2 or 3 other places. And I will say that once again, no, I'm not every developer, but there's a lot like me, and I'm a for-profit. Nonprofits are doing this in spades, but there are other for-profits, and a lot of them that want to also do the same things. Just enable and empower good people and the right people to do the right things, rather than neglect everything just because there are some bad agents running around.
I might introduce one last topic, Stephanie, and Joel hit on this a minute ago or earlier in this discussion, and that has to do with kind of transportation related things. I think another thing that we hear often in most of the meetings that we discuss this is that these proposals will contribute to more traffic congestion and problems in the city related to that, more small apartment buildings, even accessory dwellings and single family, will exacerbate congestion in the city. And again, it's just counterintuitive, but the fact of the matter is the region's growing. As I said, people are coming. Congratulations, they're coming here. And the fact of the matter is every single person that you can put in the city, whether it's in an accessory dwelling or a small apartment building near a MARTA station or whatever, is helping the transportation system. these are people that will be here, will be moving about. If we have to put more people in closer proximity to MARTA stations and bus routes, and please, that people can walk and ride their bike to do something. You know, I mean, I don't mean every trip, but if a quarter of most households' trips could be walking and bicycling, now we're addressing the transportation problem. The only way to do that is by addressing where people are living, not by adding more lanes or changing the turn signal timing and these kinds of things. That's a fantasy. It's by doing these things that put people where they can move around, not in a car, for some things. And so I feel it's important to acknowledge the relationship between changes like this and solving our transportation problem, not exacerbating.
And I think alongside of that, the conversation is around, and Tim mentioned this earlier, sustainability of funding and subsidy. I think that there's not a strong understanding how much just these simple changes can help reduce the amount of subsidy required, which is not even available. Subsidy for housing being built, period, affordable housing, all types of housing. And I hate to always use affordable, attainable housing, because in Atlanta, understand this is across all workforce affordability. Like, people are buying houses, like 80% of the buyers in Atlanta right now are outside of Atlanta. People are buying houses for $80,000 over ask in neighborhoods that are all over Atlanta. And so the affordability is for folks that even are in six figures, who, like I said, it's coming. Like, the same people who can't afford a house in Seattle and the Bay Area and LA, it's coming, everybody. Like, I can't say it enough. Like, it's already here, but it's coming even more. And so how we're going to do this in a sustainable, non-overly subsidized way is also important. And this is how you get to those numbers. We did a project and are unfolding a project in English Avenue where we went through a rezoning. And I did neighborhood meetings with the MPU at the neighborhood level and everything. And I showed them data. I like a lot of the data and the information that's being put in the chats, because this isn't hearsay. It's just facts and data. And we showed them that we could take that single family lot that right now could create a single house. Even if we made it affordable, even if we made it single family, it doesn't matter. It's one unit. Or we can easily create 4 units of housing overnight with no change, but allowing for it to allow for 4 units of housing. It actually would decrease the cost of the overall development. It would increase the affordability and the number of affordable units, but it also just increases the number of units. 4, last time I checked, is higher than 1, and we need housing. That supply-demand number imbalance that Josh referred to, this is a big part of the issue. So regardless, we need more housing. The question is where are we going to place that housing? How are we going to place it? Are we going to be inefficient with the trees that we have to tear down a tree and have 1 unit of housing? Or are we going to tear down a tree and at least get from that 5 households, 6 households, 12 households? This is just the common sense data that all of this requires, but it is very impactful when it comes down to a simple change that does not mean moving heaven and earth. If we make this change, the number of things that it will unfold in a productive manner in all of our neighborhoods, including neglected neighborhoods and our advanced neighborhoods, is just tremendous. And to that car transportation standpoint, in Atlanta, and I'll take this back to history. I remember when nobody in Atlanta wanted to have new MARTA stations or transit built next to them. And economically, there was a good reason for that. And everybody said it's going to bring safety issues, it's going to bring poor people, all of this stuff. You know, everybody can go wherever they want to. But then all of a sudden, something happened when State Farm and Mercedes-Benz said, we selected our locations for our offices in Atlanta because of transit. That changed the whole dynamic to an economically positive and beneficial dynamic that still continues today. So think about the housing as being an important piece of that, which is State Farm and Mercedes wanted to be next to transit so that their workers could get there easily via transportation modes. But guess what? We also need people to be living first at point A to get onto that station. And that's where the need for a little bit more density is very impactful to allow more people to access a resource that will reduce the number of cars potentially on the roadways, increase the flexibility for people who don't want to have cars to take a transit station, and then get to another center of job access and things like that. And so I do want to say these are very impactful and important issues that I don't have to agree with every single one to say, yes, let's start checking some of the boxes and continue to move forward.
Stephanie, can I jump in real quick and just do rapid fire on a couple of questions? Because I know we're getting close on time. They came in the chat.
For sure.
Okay. So I saw one early on question about the density bonus and FAR increases for MRMU. I know this has been in the weeds question. We are looking at how to pull that together. I got a couple meetings tomorrow. Our goal is that it would allow for some type of FAR increase as well. I know most density bonuses don't do that, but that's something that we're working through to how we could allow that in the situation, since this is a bit of a unique density bonus moving from single family to a little bit larger. There was a question around higher density areas and kind of most of the focus tonight being on like the lower and, single family and near MARTA stations. We are also, the Atlanta City Design Housing work we put a lot of work and thought into thinking about how to incentivize density in those areas, because zoning is not necessarily the issue oftentimes in the growth corridors or the core of the city. Question is really around how do we incentivize it, and so we're working, and the urban enterprise zone that we mentioned earlier, housing opportunity bond, otherwise, how do we really dedicate the subsidy or other types of tools of incentive to incentivize higher density multifamily development with affordable housing, and focusing our dedicated affordable housing in those areas as well, I think is a big part of that work. So I know it was a bit absent from our presentation tonight, but absolutely on our radar. We think that a lot of the growth in the city needs to happen in the growth corridor. And then the last thing I'll mention is related to what Joel picked up on kind of the questions around affordability. One thing for me that I think is really important to say, and I don't think I said it during the presentation, is that we're very aware that zoning is not some type of silver bullet or panacea that's going to fix housing affordability in the city, but is part of the solution. That we need a lot of, we need probably 1,000 little solutions to make the city work better and more inclusive and affordable ways than it does right now. And the goal in a lot of ways of the work we're doing is to take pressure off of the lowest end portion of the market to allow for supply. Not that all of the supply is going to be deeply affordable supply, but even moderately affordable takes a lot of pressure off the market. And we'll free up the subsidy that we do have, the 3,500 units that Tim mentioned earlier from the housing bond, to go toward lowest income dedicated affordable housing. Because right now we're putting 60, 80, 100% AMI units, and we're using subsidy to do it. And so by introducing additional tools in the market, we can create more affordable housing through the use of other tools as well as zoning. So this is not in a bubble or a vacuum. This is not the only type of housing affordability work we're doing, but we think a critical part of pulling it all together. So that's a lot of, I think those were the kind of the core ones I missed, and Caroline, I mentioned in the chat, we will follow up with any of you that we didn't get to your questions on the call. So I'll turn it back over to you, Stephanie.
Well, I think we're out of time. Thanks so much for.
Oh, yes, we are. Yeah.
Yeah, these are great questions and answers. Thank you again.
Thank you, Stephanie and Joel, for doing this. Appreciate it, and everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Hope you all have a great night.
Good night.
Good night.